Imagine that you are lying in your bed, the blanket resting softly across your chest, the air in the room quiet except for the faint hum of the night beyond your window. Your body is tired, but your mind still wanders, searching for a story to hold on to as you sink into rest. If you have ever loved tales of ancient times, of distant shores and the weight of forgotten wars, then stay with me now, because tonight I will guide you gently into the heart of one of the most famous stories ever told. It is the story of Troy, of warriors and kings, of a war that seemed endless, and of a single idea, strange, dangerous, and brilliant, that would finally bring it to an end. You will not need to remember dates or memorize names, for I will tell it slowly, like a lullaby of history. All you need to do is listen, to imagine, and to allow yourself to drift. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders sink into the mattress, and come with me now, to the shores of a burning sea, where ships once waited, and where one man began to whisper of wood and silence. The war for Troy had lasted so long that even the gods seemed weary of it. The wide plain before the city had been trampled by the feet of countless soldiers, and the dust of a decade clung to the very stones. The air smelled of old smoke and salt from the sea, and when the wind shifted, it carried with it the sour scent of sweat-soaked leather, of bodies too long confined within armor, of blood dried into the earth. The Greeks had come with more than 1,000 ships, a fleet so large that when it first appeared, it was said to darken the horizon. Yet after 10 years of battle, the city still stood, proud and unbroken, its high walls gleaming in the sun like the bones of some ancient giant. Among the Greek leaders, each a king in his own right, there was a growing heaviness. Agamemnon, lord of Mycenae, carried the burden of command, his voice rough with years of shouting orders, his eyes dimmed by loss. Menelaus, whose stolen wife Helen had sparked the war, grew restless, pacing his tent as if he could wear grooves in the earth itself. Ajax, massive and unyielding, clenched his fists at the thought that all his strength could not bring the city down. And Odysseus, clever, sharp-eyed, his mind always turning, sat apart, his gaze not on the walls of Troy but on the horizon, as if waiting for inspiration to come from the sea itself. Night after night, the Greeks gathered around their fires. The flames crackled, sparks floating into the sky like lost souls, and the soldiers huddled closer, speaking in low voices. They spoke of home, of vineyards and olive groves, of children who might no longer remember their fathers' faces, of wives who might have remarried in their absence. They spoke, too, of fear, of how long a man could fight before he forgot why, of whether the gods had abandoned them. It was during one of these nights, when the wind was cold and the stars seemed distant, that Odysseus rose from his place by the fire. His cloak hung loosely over his shoulders, and his shadow stretched long behind him. The men fell silent, for when Odysseus spoke, they listened, not because his voice was loud, but because it carried weight. "We cannot take the city by force," he said, his words slow, as though he were measuring each one before letting it slip into the night. "Its walls are too strong, its defenders too determined. 10 years we have battered against it, and still Troy stands. But there are other ways to win a war. Not with strength, with cunning." The soldiers shifted uneasily. Some murmured that cunning was a coward's path, others that it was the only path left. Odysseus did not argue. Instead, he crouched, and with the end of a burnt stick, he drew in the dirt before them. A shape began to form, broad at the base, narrowing as it rose, curving like the body of an animal. At first they could not see it, until he added the lines of a neck, the suggestion of a head, the outline of legs. "A horse," one man whispered, the word almost lost beneath the hiss of the fire. Odysseus looked up then, his eyes glinting with a light that was not entirely from the flames. "A horse, yes. Not a horse of flesh, but of wood. A gift, or so it will seem. We will build it so vast, so strange, that the Trojans cannot ignore it. And within it—" He paused, letting the silence stretch until the men leaned forward, drawn into the web of his thought. "Within it We will hide. The air seemed to thicken, the crackle of the fire louder, the weight of the idea settling upon them. Some laughed, uneasy. Others frowned, trying to see how such madness could lead to victory. But Odysseus straightened, his voice firm. They trust in their walls. They trust in their gods. Let us give them a gift they believe comes from both. They will take it into their city with their own hands, and when night falls, the gates will open, for us. The nights before the idea took shape were heavy with silence, broken only by the hiss of the sea against the shore and the occasional groan of ships rocking gently on their anchors. The Greek camp stretched across the plain like a weary beast, tents sagging, fires burning low, weapons left leaning against poles that had seen too many seasons of war. The air was salted with the dampness of the waves, yet underneath lingered the harsher odors of leather, unwashed skin, and the faint iron tang of rusting armor. Men had grown thin and hollow-eyed. Their hands were scarred, their feet hardened by years of standing in dust and blood, and still they remained. For 10 years they had watched the towers of Troy rise unbroken above the plain, their pale stone catching the morning sun as though mocking the countless dead who had tried and failed to breach them. In those nights Odysseus walked among the soldiers. He moved quietly, as though the weight of his thoughts pressed down on his shoulders, but his eyes never ceased their restless gleam. He passed men who whispered of home, of fields where grapes ripened in the heat, of daughters who must now be grown women, of wives whose faces had blurred with time. He heard their longing, their weariness, and beneath it all, their despair. When he finally spoke of his plan, it was not with the thunder of command, but with the calm certainty of a man who had wandered through shadows and returned carrying a flame. Around a circle of tired warriors, by the dim glow of a fire reduced to embers, he scratched the outline into the dirt, the curved flanks, the arched neck, the suggestion of hooves. The men leaned closer, their breath mingling in the cool night air. At first they did not understand. A horse, a shape of wood. But Odysseus' voice deepened, and the embers seemed to flicker with the urgency of his words. He spoke of the Trojans' pride, their love of omens, their reverence for offerings left to the gods. He spoke of a gift so vast and strange that it could not be ignored, a symbol they would welcome into their city. And he spoke of the hollow space within, large enough to cradle chosen warriors, their hearts steady in the darkness until the time came to strike. The men murmured uneasily, yet the thought had already taken hold. They imagined the astonished faces of the Trojans, the awe as the wooden beast was wheeled toward the gates, the blind eagerness with which they might drag it inside their walls. Some scoffed, others nodded slowly, but all of them felt the tremor of possibility. The next day, under the pale morning light, work began. The sound of axes rang across the camp as men struck the trunks of pines brought down from the nearby slopes. Chips of resin-scented wood flew through the air, sticking to the sweat-damp skin of the laborers. The smell of fresh sap was sharp, mingling with the smoke of the fires, filling the camp with an almost forest-like freshness that seemed strange in a place of war. Carpenters and shipwrights, men who had once built the very vessels that carried the army across the sea, now bent their craft to something far stranger. They hauled beams with ropes, hammered joints until their palms blistered, and shaped the planks into curves that suggested the body of a living creature. The creak of wood, the rasp of saws, the rhythmic pound of mallets filled the air from sunrise to dusk, and for the first time in many months there was a hum of purpose among the Greeks. At night, when the fires burned low, the half-formed body of the horse loomed in the shadows, its hollow ribs open to the stars. Men would glance toward it uneasily, as if the shape itself held some living spirit, something both protective and dangerous. Whispers spread that Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, had guided Odysseus' hand, that this wooden beast was touched by divine will. Inside the camp, chosen warriors prepared themselves for the role that awaited them. They tested their armor in silence, adjusted the leather straps, and ran their fingers along the hilts of swords dulled by years of use. Some prayed, lips moving soundlessly, to be granted the courage to sit in darkness without stirring, to hold their breath as footsteps passed so close they might hear the heartbeat of their enemies. Others feared not the waiting, but the thought of being trapped within the beast, surrounded by wood, unable to flee if fire should be set to it. Odysseus visited them often, speaking in a voice quiet yet firm. He reminded them that wars were not won only with the clash of spears, but with the turn of the mind, and that their courage lay not in standing before walls, but in outwitting those who hid behind them. As the days passed, the figure rose higher, until its head seemed to gaze toward the distant city, its wooden ears pricked, its great flanks sealed smooth with planks that smelled of pitch and resin. The sun baked the surface until it shone like polished bronze, and the shadows it cast stretched long across the sand. When at last the horse stood completed, it was both magnificent and unsettling. Its hollow body echoed with every gust of wind, a low groaning that made men glance over their shoulders. The Greeks gathered before it, silent, their faces lit by the glow of evening. They could see the strangeness of what they had made, something too large, too deliberate, to be simply wood and nails. It was a vessel of deceit, a weapon disguised as a gift, a gamble on which the fate of their long war now rested. That night the camp was quiet. The soldiers lay awake, staring at the canvas of their tents, hearing the soft lap of waves against the shore. Some dreamed of home, others of death, and a few of triumph so close they could almost taste it. Beyond the walls, the Trojans kept their watch, unaware that within a day they would see something rise on the plain that would test their hearts as surely as any spear. The morning came with a clear sky, the air already warm, carrying the scent of salt and smoke. The Greeks, weary yet disciplined, moved with a solemn purpose. Fires were quenched, tents struck, supplies packed as though they were abandoning their long struggle. And there, left behind on the wide plain, stood the horse, its vast shadow stretching toward the city walls. From the towers of Troy, the sentinels leaned forward, shading their eyes. They saw the dust of the departing army, the gleam of ships drawn toward the sea, and in the emptiness they saw also the strange figure, tall and still, a horse wrought from timber, as though carved by giants. The Trojans stirred with wonder, with suspicion, with hope. What was this thing, left standing like a sentinel where once the fury of battle had raged? Was it a gift to the gods, an offering of surrender, or some omen they had not yet understood? And so they began to gather at the gates, their voices rising in curiosity, their hearts torn between caution and triumph, while the wooden beast waited in silence, its hollow belly already filled with breathless men. The first to speak aloud among the crowd was an elder, his voice cracked with years, but still carrying across the plain like the call of a horn. He urged caution, reminding all who listened that the Greeks were not to be trusted, that gifts from enemies often carried poisons unseen. His gnarled hand trembled as he pointed toward the wooden beast, its polished flanks gleaming in the sunlight. "It stands too tall," he said, "and its belly is too wide. Who carves a gift in secret? Who leaves behind such a shape when all else is taken away?" Yet even as he spoke, the younger men pressed closer to the gates, their eyes lit with wonder. To them the horse looked not like a trap, but like a trophy, the proof that Troy had endured, that the Greeks had finally abandoned their fruitless siege. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders so that they might glimpse the strange creature of wood, and the little ones laughed, pointing at its towering head that seemed almost alive. Messengers were sent to the princes and to Priam himself, the aged king whose years had weighed heavily upon him. He was brought out from the palace, leaning on his staff, his robes trailing across the stone. The people parted as he approached, and he gazed at the horse with eyes grown dim yet still searching. To him it seemed both beautiful and troubling, like a dream half remembered upon waking. He asked for counsel, and his sons and captains gathered, their voices rising in argument. One urged that the horse be dragged into the city as a prize, an offering to Athena who had long favored the Greeks. Another insisted it should be burned where it stood, reduced to ashes so that no secret within could harm them. Still others suggested dismantling it piece by piece, to see what lay inside. Each voice grew louder, and the people pressed closer, their curiosity sharpening into impatience. Meanwhile, inside the hollow belly of the beast, the chosen warriors waited. Sweat gathered beneath their armor, trickling down their backs. The air was hot, heavy with the scent of pine and pitch, and every breath seemed to echo in the cramped space. They sat motionless in the dark, swords at their sides, ears straining to catch the muffled sounds beyond the planks, the murmur of voices, the scrape of sandals against stone, the far-off cries of gulls. One shifted slightly, his knee pressing against the timber, and the wood groaned faintly. At once all froze, hearts pounding. But outside, the sound was lost amid the clamor of debate, unnoticed by the Trojans who circled the horse like bees around a hive. As the sun climbed higher, the heat deepened. Dust shimmered on the plain, and the scent of the sea carried faintly on the wind. Priam stood long before the horse, his hand resting on the carved leg, his palm against the sun-warmed wood. He closed his eyes, as if trying to hear through the silence, but all he felt was the steady thrum of the day. At last, a commotion rose at the far edge of the gathering. Guards dragged forward a man, bound and beaten, his face streaked with blood and dust. He stumbled as they pushed him, falling to his knees before the king. The crowd hushed, their eyes turning to the stranger. This was Sinon, a Greek left behind, his body marked with lashes as though he had suffered punishment from his own army. He cried out to Priam and to all the Trojans that he had been abandoned, betrayed, that he sought only refuge from his merciless leaders. His voice cracked with desperation, his hands lifted in plea, and when asked of the horse, he spoke carefully, weaving a tale that fell like honey into eager ears. He said it was an offering, built to appease Athena, to grant safe passage to the Greeks as they sailed away. He said it had been made so vast that no Trojan could carry it within their city, for if they did, the goddess would turn her favor from the Greeks to them, blessing Troy with everlasting strength. The crowd stirred. Murmurs rippled like waves. Could this be true? Could the strange gift be not a trap, but a token of divine favor? The younger men cheered, imagining the glory of dragging such a monument through the gates. The elders frowned, yet their voices wavered beneath the weight of the people's swelling desire. Inside the horse, the warriors listened, every nerve stretched thin. They heard Sinon's words, though muffled, and knew the cunning of Odysseus had not ended with the plan itself. It lived in the tongue of this desperate man, convincing their enemies even as they sat trembling in the dark. As dusk approached, the debate still raged. The sky burned with streaks of red and gold, and the great horse loomed against the glow like a figure of legend. Torches were lit, their flames wavering in the breeze, and the Trojans did not disperse. They lingered by the gates, drawn to the silent shape as though it held their fate. And the men within, cramped and waiting, pressed their foreheads against the timber, their hearts echoing the slow beat of night descending. Night deepened, and the stars came out one by one above the plain. The walls of Troy glimmered faintly in the torchlight, their stone cool under the rising moon. Still the people lingered before the gates, unwilling to leave the strange gift standing outside their city. It seemed to call to them, that silent horse, its shadow stretching across the ground like a question too great to ignore. Sinon, still bound but watched closely, continued his tale. He spoke of how the Greeks had angered Athena, how they had built the horse in atonement, and how, had they made it small enough to fit easily within Troy, the goddess would not have turned her blessing upon the Trojans. "It must be vast," he whispered hoarsely, "so that you could never take it into your city. For if you did, if it stood within your walls, Athena would favor you forever." The crowd shifted uneasily, some whispering prayers, others smiling with a kind of desperate hope. For 10 years they had endured siege, seen fields burned, friends slain, children grow up knowing only the sound of war beyond the gates. Now here was an ending offered not by the sword, but by a gift, a sign of divine will. Among the people rose different voices. One elder, Laocoon, high priest of Poseidon, stepped forward with anger burning in his eyes. "Fools," he cried, his voice ringing through the night air, "do not trust Greeks, even when they bring gifts. There is treachery in this wood, I swear it." He urged them to burn it where it stood, to split the planks apart and reveal its hollow heart. To prove his words, he hurled a spear into the horse's flank. The weapon struck with a hollow thud. A faint shudder ran through the wood, and the sound echoed strangely, as though the beast had a belly of emptiness. Some in the crowd gasped. A few drew back, suspicion flickering in their eyes. For a moment, silence fell heavy, and inside the horse the hidden warriors held their breath, each man frozen as though turned to stone. But then the silence broke with the laughter of youths, who mocked the priest's fear. The crowd shifted again, and the voice of caution was drowned by the voice of longing. For they wished to believe in triumph, to believe the long years of suffering were finally ended, and no hollow sound could easily break the sweetness of hope. Still, doubt lingered, and as though the gods themselves wished to end it, another omen came. For Laocoon, standing in fury before the people, was struck by fate. From the sea beyond, twin serpents rose, gliding with terrible grace across the waves, their bodies glistening in the moonlight, eyes burning like embers. They coiled upon the shore, their scales rasping against the sand, and before any could move, they seized Laocoon and his sons, wrapping them in living chains. The crowd screamed, scattered, but none could help. The serpents crushed the life from the priest and his children, then slid away to coil themselves at the foot of Athena's temple, their vast bodies gleaming under the stars. The people trembled, and their voices turned against the priest. They said he had angered the gods, that he had struck the sacred horse with his spear, and the serpents were punishment. They cried that the horse must be brought into the city, that Athena's will was clear. And so, as the moon climbed higher, ropes were fastened to the beast, wheels placed beneath its legs, and with shouts and straining backs the Trojans began to drag it toward their gates. The wooden frame groaned as it shifted, and sparks from torches danced across its polished sides. From within, the hidden warriors felt each jolt, each creak of movement. Darkness swayed around them, and their hearts hammered in rhythm with the grinding of the wheels. They dared not whisper, dared not even breathe too deeply, as the voices of their enemies surrounded them, joyous and unsuspecting. The gates of Troy opened wide, their massive beams swinging inward. Trumpets sounded, horns echoed through the streets, and the people poured forth in celebration. They led the horse into the city, through the very gates the Greeks had failed to breach in 10 long years of war. And so the beast passed within the walls, to stand in the heart of Troy beneath the watch of gods and men alike. The people danced, flames leapt high, and the night grew loud with music, wine, and relief. But inside the horse, the warriors remained in silence, waiting, as shadows flickered beyond the seams of wood, and the city around them began to drown itself in joy. The horse now stood in the very heart of Troy, towering above the squares and temples, its flanks glowing in the light of hundreds of torches. The streets swelled with people, their voices lifted in laughter that had been too long absent. 10 years of grief seemed to melt away in a single night, replaced with music, dancing, and the sweet taste of victory. Wine was poured until the jars ran empty. Musicians played pipes and lyres, their melodies carried on the warm breeze. Mothers clasped their children, fathers clasped one another's shoulders, lovers embraced without fear. For the first time in a generation, Troy felt free, as though the air itself had grown lighter within the safety of its walls. The great horse loomed over all of it, shadowed and silent, watching as though it were a god gazing upon its worshippers. Some crowned it with garlands, hanging wreaths of flowers upon its wooden mane. Others lit incense, the smoke curling upward, blurring the starlight above. It became not merely a gift, but a monument, a sign of their endurance, their triumph over the relentless invaders who had finally gone. And yet, in the midst of joy, the horse groaned faintly when the night wind pressed against its sides. No one heeded it, or if they heard, they turned their ears away, for they did not wish to be disturbed by doubt. They wanted only to believe the war was ended, that tomorrow would bring peace. Inside the hollow belly, the chosen warriors endured the press of darkness. Their armor clinked softly when they shifted, though they froze at every sound. Sweat beaded upon their foreheads and ran down their necks, trapped by leather straps. Their throats ached with thirst, but they made no sound. Through narrow seams between the planks, a faint glow of torchlight reached them, along with muffled bursts of laughter, the high notes of songs, and the rhythmic thud of dancing feet. Hours passed. The sounds of festivity grew louder, then gradually less steady. Wine dulled voices into slurred chants, then into murmurs, then finally into silence broken only by the occasional cry of joy or collapse of a man too heavy with drink. The torches guttered, one by one, until the streets lay in dim shadow beneath the moon. The horse stood unmoving, its shape black against the pale stones, while all around it the city succumbed to sleep. Guards slouched at their posts, heads nodding, their spears slipping from weary hands. Musicians dozed beside their instruments, cups spilled at their sides. Families lay together on mats, still smiling in their dreams. Troy had opened its gates to both triumph and doom, though none within yet knew it. Inside the horse, the warriors kept their vigil. They breathed slowly, waiting, their hands resting on their weapons. The darkness was heavy, but in it lay a single flame, the certainty of what was to come, the knowledge that before the dawn the city would change forever. And so the night deepened, quiet at last, the city dreaming beneath the gaze of the wooden beast, while within its hollow heart men sat in silence, counting the moments until the signal would come. The city of Troy slept beneath the pale wash of the moon, its towers gleaming like bones against the night sky. The wind carried the faint scent of wine-soaked earth and extinguished torches, mingled with the salt of the distant sea. Streets that only hours ago had thrummed with music and laughter were now empty, strewn with discarded garlands, overturned amphorae, and the faint imprint of dancing feet pressed into the dust. Silence held sway, broken only by the soft lapping of waves against the harbour stones and the creak of ropes from ships that no longer stood there. Above the silent square, the wooden horse loomed, dark and immense, its hollow body swollen with breath and suppressed movement. Within, men crouched like shadows pressed against shadows, their limbs stiff with hours of stillness, their throats raw from silence. Each heartbeat seemed loud enough to betray them, yet the city outside gave no sign of suspicion. Troy lay defenceless in its slumber. Odysseus, wedged near the narrow seam cut into the horse's side, pressed his eye against the gap. The faint glow of starlight met him, and with it the sight of slumped guards leaning heavily upon their spears. A dog trotted aimlessly across the square, sniffed at a pile of crumbs, then curled into a ball and fell asleep beneath the horse's hoof. The stillness was total, so complete it felt sacred. A hand brushed his shoulder in the darkness. The signal. He turned, finding the dim outline of Diomedes' face, eyes gleaming like flint. Without words, they both knew the time had come. The plank was eased aside with slow precision. The wood sighed faintly as it shifted, but no answering cry came from the sleeping city. One by one, shadows slipped out, landing softly upon the stone with the stealth of hunters. Their armor, muted with strips of cloth to silence the clink, gleamed only in fragments where moonlight caught it. They crouched low, weapons drawn, breath shallow. Hippias, the builder of the horse, was among the first to emerge, his broad frame moving with surprising quiet. He glanced up at the structure he had crafted, towering in the center of Troy, a monument of deception, now delivering the vengeance concealed within. Odysseus raised his hand. From the darkness of the plain beyond the city, where the Greek fleet had feigned retreat, a hidden beacon flickered to life. Far off, sails caught the moonlight as the ships returned, silent as spectres gliding across the water. Within Troy, the warriors fanned outward, their feet finding the familiar paths of a city they had stalked for a decade from beyond its walls. They moved toward the gates, blades at the ready, while others remained to guard the square. A child stirred in a doorway, rubbing his eyes at the sight of strange figures moving through the night, but his mother, half asleep, pulled him back into the house, whispering that dreams still held him. No alarm was raised. At the gates, Sinon awaited them. He had played his role as the abandoned Greek so well that the Trojans had spared him, trusting his tale of sacrifice and retreat. Now, with trembling hands, he fumbled at the great bolts, sliding them free, while warriors pressed against the heavy timbers. The wood groaned, the iron hinges shrieked softly, yet the city did not wake. Then, with a shudder, the gates of Troy opened wide. From the sea, the army poured in, thousands of men who had hidden in wait, their torches veiled, their oars muffled. The silent tide of warriors flooded the sleeping streets, their sandals striking in unison upon the stones, a rhythm of inevitability. The night, once gentle, now shifted. The air grew tense, weighted with the scent of sweat, oil, and iron. Dogs lifted their heads, uneasy. Somewhere, a drunken voice stirred and fell quiet again. Troy slumbered on the edge of its ruin, unaware that its final dawn was already stolen. And in the square, the horse stood empty now, its purpose fulfilled, a hollow witness to the treachery it had birthed. The city of Troy lay beneath the soft curve of the moon, wrapped in silence so profound that even the faintest stir of leaves seemed like a whisper from the gods. Its walls, proud and scarred from a decade of siege, gleamed pale beneath the stars, and its towers rose like blackened teeth against the sky. From the plain beyond the gates, no sound of enemy drums came, no clatter of foreign spears. For the first time in years, the night seemed gentle. The air held the mingled scents of extinguished torches, of spilled wine soaking into dust, of hearth fires burned down to ash. The great squares, once thundering with music and rejoicing, now lay abandoned, strewn with garlands trampled underfoot, fragments of broken cups, and the faint glitter of coins lost during the revels. At the heart of the city, the colossal horse stood in perfect stillness. Shadows pooled beneath its legs, and the moonlight traced the grain of its timbers, making them seem like the muscles of some living beast. Its hollow belly groaned faintly when the night wind pressed against it, but no ear remained sharp enough to hear. The Trojans slept, conquered not by swords, but by the sweet weight of wine, of weariness, of relief after too many years of grief. Inside the horse, however, there was no rest. Dozens of warriors crouched in darkness, their armor muffled with strips of leather, their weapons bound to silence. The air was thick with sweat, with dust, and the sour tang of iron. Each man breathed shallowly, afraid his exhale might echo too loudly. The hours pressed upon them like heavy stones, and their limbs ached from stillness, yet none dared shift more than a finger. Odysseus, wedged near a narrow slit in the wood, held his gaze fixed on the square outside. Through the gap he saw the guards slumped by the gates, heads heavy upon their chests, spears sliding from weary hands. He saw the faint glow of a brazier guttering in the wind, sparks drifting like fireflies before dying in the dust. And he saw the dog that had curled beneath the horse's hoof, breathing softly in its sleep, untroubled by the men who crouched above it. Time passed slowly, counted in the drip of sweat down a brow, the silent throb of blood in the temples. When at last the moon climbed higher and the city lay sunk deep into its dreams, Odysseus felt a hand brush his shoulder. In the darkness, Diomedes' eyes glinted faintly. The signal was given. The plank shifted with a long, slow sigh, the sound of wood stretching after long confinement. The gap widened, and cool night air poured in, sharp and damp with the scent of stone. One by one, the warriors slipped through, shadows peeling away from shadow. They landed softly on the stones, bending low, their sandals whispering against the dust. No voice rose to challenge them. The square lay deserted, haunted only by the sound of the wind threading through empty streets. Hippias, the builder of the horse, was among the first to step out. He paused, his hand brushing the flank of the structure he had made, marveling at its size, its hollow power. A tool of deception, carved with his own hands, had now carried within it the vengeance of all Greece. His lips pressed tight, he turned away, blade ready. They moved as one, spreading outward into the city. Some took positions near the square, guarding the monstrous gift. Others followed Odysseus and Diomedes toward the gates, where Sinon waited. The false captive, the man who had tricked the Trojans with his tale of sacrifice, now stirred from his feigned sleep. His heart beat so violently he feared it would betray him, yet he forced his hands steady as they reached for the bolts. The gates of Troy, tall as towers, barred with heavy beams of oak, groaned when touched. Odysseus pressed his shoulder against the wood, Diomedes with him, and others lent their strength. The iron fittings creaked, a shrill note in the silence. For a breathless instant all froze, listening. From the houses nearby came only the muffled snore of a drunk soldier, the faint cry of an infant stirred in its sleep. No alarm rose. Slowly, the gates swung wide. Beyond the walls, the plain stretched pale beneath the stars. At its edge, faint lights flickered, torches veiled against discovery. Then came the sound, at first a murmur, then a gathering roar, the steady beat of oars upon water, the hiss of prows cutting through the sea. The Greek fleet, long hidden on a nearby isle, returned now like phantoms summoned by the gods. Their sails glimmered faintly, pale as wings in the moonlight. The first wave of warriors slipped through the gates, their faces gaunt with hunger and patience, their eyes glittering with the fire of long-withheld fury. They moved swiftly, spreading into the streets, their sandals striking stone in a rhythm as relentless as fate. Behind them came more, and more still, until the dark plain itself seemed to rise and flow into the city. Within Troy, silence fractured. Dogs lifted their heads, ears pricked, uneasy growls vibrating in their throats. A guard stirred, blinking, frowning at the sight of strange figures passing through the gates. His voice rose in confusion, but before the word left his mouth, a blade silenced him, and he crumpled without sound. The Greeks fanned outward. Some made for the temples, where treasures lay hidden. Others pressed toward the barracks, where soldiers slept in drunken stupor. Still others remained by the gates, ushering their comrades into the city. The streets darkened with shadows of spears and helmets, a tide unstoppable now that it had begun to flow. Yet Troy still dreamed. In narrow houses, families lay close together, mothers with infants pressed to their breasts, fathers sprawled in the warmth of victory. They dreamed of fields free of spears, of mornings without alarms, of markets filled with laughter instead of hunger. In their dreams, Troy still lived, still shone, still promised a future. None yet knew that the future had already slipped away. In the palace, high upon its terraces, Priam slept in a chair, too weary even to reach his bed. His old hands rested upon the arms of his seat, veins blue beneath thin skin, his head bowed. Nearby, Cassandra wandered the halls, her hair unbound, her eyes burning with visions that none would heed. She whispered warnings to the pillars, to the statues, to the shadows on the walls, for no mortal ear would listen. "The fire comes," she murmured. "The blood is already in the streets." But her voice carried no weight, her words tangled in madness. The guards turned their faces away, unwilling to disturb the king with the ramblings of his cursed daughter. The night deepened. The Greeks spread farther. Torches were kindled at last, their flames shielded until the moment struck. The air thickened with smoke, with sweat, with the metallic tang of drawn swords. The city still slept, but its dream was breaking. At the square, the horse loomed above the empty streets, hollow now, a shell that had already fulfilled its destiny. Beneath its gaze, the last of the hidden warriors emerged, stretching stiffened limbs, drawing blades free of their wrappings. They looked around at the silent houses, at the scattered garlands and broken cups, at the emptiness that awaited the scream. And in that silence, the first sparks of ruin flickered to life. The city seemed endless in its silence, as though even the stones themselves were holding their breath. The narrow lanes twisted away from the central square like veins from a heart, their cobbles polished by countless feet, their shadows stretched into black abysses. The Greeks moved through them cautiously, their sandals pressing dust into the cracks, their eyes alert to every shuttered doorway, every unlit window. The night air hung heavy with the smells of the city, the faint reek of stale wine, the smoke of dying hearths, the sweetness of crushed figs discarded after the feast. From within houses came muffled sounds, the restless turning of a sleeper, the thin whimper of a child stirred by dreams. But no voices challenged the intruders, no alarm was raised. Troy lay deep within the fragile cocoon of its slumber, and each heartbeat of quiet made the Greeks bolder. Odysseus led his men through a winding street toward the great gates. His mind, sharp even in the haze of exhaustion, counted every corner, every tower, every possible place where resistance might appear. He thought of Ithaca, of the cliffs washed in foam, of Penelope weaving and unweaving her endless cloth. Yet he forced these images aside. Memory was dangerous here. Memory softened the edge. Only cunning must remain. At the gates, the flow of warriors thickened. From the plain beyond, the flood of returning ships disgorged their crews, and the dark tide poured steadily into the city. Bronze helmets glimmered faintly beneath the starlight, shields pressed close to silent chests, spears carried like shadows of trees in the night. Each man who entered carried within him the bitterness of years wasted on this war, the grief of comrades lost, the hunger for release. Troy was their release. Within the walls, Cassandra wandered still. Her bare feet whispered across cold marble floors, her hands brushed against stone as though to steady herself in a world that reeled with visions. She saw flames licking the roofs, heard screams that had not yet been uttered, tasted ash on her tongue though the air was yet sweet. She called upon Apollo, upon her father, upon any who might believe. But no one listened. The gods had given her sight without persuasion, and her warnings were swallowed by the silence. Far below, in the lower quarters of the city, a fisherman stirred in his sleep. He dreamed of the shore, of waves washing nets clean of salt, of his son running barefoot on the sands. He did not know that the very shore he dreamed of now held ships creeping closer, oars muffled, sails furled to keep their approach unseen. In another house, a weaver turned in her bed, murmuring a prayer for the morning market. She did not know that no market would dawn. The Greeks spread farther. Some climbed the steep streets toward the citadel, where temples crowned the heights. Others veered toward the barracks, where Trojan soldiers snored in drunken oblivion. Still others remained at the gates, ensuring the stream of men did not falter. In hushed voices they passed commands, gestures sharp and silent, discipline binding them tighter than chains. They were shadows among shadows, phantoms with blades. At last, the first torch was raised. Its flame trembled in the breeze, a fragile flower of light in the vast dark. The man who held it shielded it carefully with his cloak, waiting for the signal. His breath came shallow, his fingers curled white around the wood. He knew what the fire meant, the end of Troy, the end of this long, weary war. Elsewhere, Paris lay restless upon his bed. The son of Priam, whose choice had kindled this war, now twisted in uneasy dreams. He saw the face of Helen, luminous and distant, yet her eyes turned away from him, her lips shaped words he could not hear. He reached for her, but the vision dissolved into smoke, into fire, into ruin. He woke with a start, his chest heaving. But when he looked about him, the palace was silent, the halls untroubled. He told himself it was nothing, only the weight of too many years, and he sank back into uneasy slumber, even as the true fire drew near. On the rooftops, the night wind stirred banners that no longer had meaning. The cloth whispered against stone, its threads frayed, its colours dimmed. Beneath it, Greek warriors crouched, their bodies pressed low, their blades catching faint gleams of starlight. They waited, every nerve strained for the moment when silence would shatter. At the foot of the citadel, a small shrine to Apollo stood quiet, its doors ajar, offerings from the feast still lying upon its steps. A cat nosed among them, licking at spilled honey, its tail flicking lazily. The cat froze as a shadow passed, ears pricked. But the shadow did not pause. It slid on, silent as mist, leaving only the faintest chill in its wake. Priam, in the palace, stirred at last. His old eyes opened, clouded with sleep, his joints stiff as he shifted in the chair. He looked toward the windows, saw the moon high, the night deep. A sigh escaped him. "It is done," he whispered, half in dream. "The war is ended. Let the city rest." He closed his eyes again, unaware that his city rested only in the stillness before storm. The first cry broke the silence like glass. A guard near the barracks, waking suddenly, saw figures moving where none should be. His shout rose, sharp and raw, echoing across the stones. In that instant, the flame was uncovered. The torch flared, casting wild shadows across walls and roofs, its light glinting on bronze. The spell of silence shattered. Dogs barked wildly, their voices cutting through the night. Windows flew open, startled faces peered into the dark. Confusion swept like wind through the alleys, rousing sleepers, stirring shouts. And into that confusion poured the Greeks, no longer shadows, but men of bronze and fury, blades raised, voices harsh. Torches spread, their flames leaping from one to the next, until whole streets glowed with their light. The darkness that had cloaked the Greeks now betrayed them, for fire revealed all. But it did not matter. The city was unprepared, its defenders scattered, its people drunk with false peace. In the palace, Cassandra fell to her knees, her voice rising in a scream that tore through stone and soul alike. "It comes! The fire comes! Troy is burning!" At last her prophecy was no longer hidden. The glow of flames lit the windows, smoke drifted upward, and the first screams of the city carried on the wind. Still, many within Troy did not yet grasp the truth. Some thought it a drunken quarrel, others a sudden blaze from the feast's torches. Mothers gathered children, fathers stumbled toward the noise with half-awake courage. Only when the clash of bronze rang clear, when blood stained the cobbles, when the enemy's war cry shook the night, did they understand. The Greeks had come, and Troy, proud Troy, slept no more. Flames rose slowly at first, licking the corners of the city's streets, a timid orange that seemed almost apologetic in the darkness. The smell of smoke, dry wood, and molten tar drifted up from the first houses, curling around the arches of Troy like a living thing. For a moment, some of the city's inhabitants believed it a festival torch, a harmless accident. Children pressed their faces to pillowcases, breathing in the unfamiliar tang of fear that now mingled with a familiar sense of home. The Greek warriors moved as shadows and fire intertwined. Their sandals whispered against cobblestones, Their blades caught glints of torchlight, turning brief flashes into streaks of silver. Through narrow lanes, they advanced quietly, yet with inevitability, like a tide that could not be turned. Each step was measured, each breath contained, each movement a choreography rehearsed over a decade of anticipation. In one small house near the edge of the marketplace, a mother, Ilara, clutched her infant to her chest. Her skin prickled with the cold that seeped through the stone walls, and the warmth of her child was a fragile shield against the fear that rose in her throat. Outside, the first cries of alarm stirred the neighborhood, the clash of bronze, the shouts of men who had finally woken from the deep sleep of complacency. She whispered to her child, half prayers, half lullabies, while the shadows of armed men passed her windows, bending and turning, flickering against the walls in torchlight. At the palace, Priam stirred fully at last. He had slept through the warning of the first flames, dreaming of past glories, of Helen's face, of the hope that perhaps this war might end without final ruin. Now, smoke curling into the high halls, the cries of his people reaching his ears, he saw with full clarity the truth he had avoided. Troy was lost. He pressed his hands to the worn armrests of his chair, feeling the grooves carved by decades of rulership, and the weight of inevitability pressed down upon his chest. Cassandra moved with the swiftness of a shadow through the palace corridors, her bare feet soft upon the marble. She opened doors to find families gathered, trembling, mothers holding children close, fathers trying to maintain calm where none could be found. The smell of burning timber crept in, sweet and suffocating, mingling with the terror in the air. Her voice, at first prophetic and ignored, now carried the raw, urgent authority of one who had seen the end before it came. "This is the work of deceit. The Greeks are within the walls," she cried. Some believed her, others stared in disbelief, and a few, paralyzed with fear, could do nothing at all. Outside, the city's streets erupted. Fire spread rapidly, creeping from thatched roofs to stone walls, fueled by oil and pitch stored for winter. The night, once quiet and watchful, now hummed with the roar of flames, the clash of swords, and the panicked cries of men and women who had never before known true terror. Smoke curled like serpents around corners, entering homes, making eyes water and lungs burn. The Greeks moved through it all, methodical, their voices low, issuing commands that carried weight and precision, while terror carried the same rhythm through every corner of Troy. In the lower quarters, merchants and tradesmen scrambled from homes, grabbing what they could. Pots of food boiled over, spilling scalding water onto floors, and children stumbled over crates and broken furniture. The scent of baked bread, once comforting, now mingled with the acrid tang of smoke and fear. In one alley, a group of soldiers found a family hiding behind overturned barrels, their eyes wide, the father raising his hands in desperation. Yet the soldiers moved silently past them, the killing yet to come focused elsewhere. Odysseus moved through the city with Diomedes, guiding their men toward the citadel. His heart was steady, his breath controlled, though a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow ran through him. Troy had resisted for 10 long years, and now it crumbled not from open battle, but from cunning, patience, and deception. He paused atop a stair, looking down at the city stretched before him. Fires rising, people running, the sound of chaos like a pulse in the night. Each scream, each step, each flicker of torchlight became part of the story, woven into the fabric of history. The palace itself was a beacon. Flames licked the balconies, and the great hall filled with smoke. Priam tried to organize a defense, but the soldiers under his command were few and uncoordinated, many having been drunk or asleep until the invasion was upon them. He grasped a spear and raised his voice, but the sound was swallowed by the din of destruction. From the upper windows, the moon illuminated the terror in the faces of those trapped inside, and Priam realized that the city would fall not in moments, but in hours, long, terrible, unrelenting hours. Among the Greeks, some paused for a breath, their hands slick with sweat, eyes adjusting to the flickering light. One looked at the flames consuming a house where children had slept moments before, and a pang of emotion struck him. Yet he swallowed it, for duty and survival demanded focus. Every block of the city taken brought them closer to the final triumph, closer to the end of the war that had stolen their youth and their friends. In the streets, fire leapt from roof to roof, sending embers into the night sky. Smoke thickened, carrying with it the smell of melting tar, charred wood, and heated stone. Windows shattered, releasing flares of light and terrified screams. The Greek warriors moved in synchrony with the chaos, each movement rehearsed, each step calculated. Streets became rivers of shadow and flame, and Troy, once proud and invincible, was now a labyrinth of fear. Ilara and her child fled down a narrow alley, past a toppled cart spilling grain, past neighbors clutching their own families. Her skin burned from the heat radiating off the walls, and soot filled her nose and mouth, yet the child pressed against her remained warm, alive. Each step was a heartbeat, each breath a prayer. The city seemed to close in, streets twisting and turning like a living maze designed to trap them, yet somewhere ahead, a glimmer of open sky promised escape, or death. At the harbor, the Greek ships waited silently, dark shapes on dark water. Those who had survived the streets and reached the edge now saw them, a strange beacon of hope amid fire and blood. Odysseus, moving through the chaos, gestured toward the distant sails. Every moment counted, every hesitation could.